Once you have an anchor tenant, it gives you the peace of mind to be able to innovate. Because the last thing you want to do is be able to live paycheck to paycheck, right? And if the company is struggling to a point where you're not able to innovate because you're worried about your finances, you're never going to be able to make that paradigm shift. Like a lot of big companies are not able to innovate because what they don't realize is the minute you put it in that mold, the well-lubricated engine they have is you're in a cast. You need to spin off. And a lot of companies create these like skunk works type projects or companies where it's running separate. It has its own budget, it has its own everything.
Welcome back to Tank Talks. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner of Ripple Ventures. And we've got another great episode today with Telecom trailblazer, Samer Bishay, who founded Iristel in 1999 as a small startup focused on VoIP services, growing it into Canada's largest independent telecommunications provider. We get Samer to share how he was able to navigate the early hurdles of competing in a market dominated by established telecom giants and dealing with the regulatory scrutiny he faced from the CRTC. Samer also shares his incredible journey co-founding satellite company Kepler Communications and Carrier One, whose pioneering decentralized and satellite-based solutions have been challenging the status quo in the Canadian telecom industry for decades. Whether you're a tech enthusiast, a policy wonk, or just curious about why your internet might not be as fast as it should be, this episode is packed with insights, so grab your headphones and settle in as we jump into the tank with Samer Bishay. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Samer.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited to be talking with a pretty successful entrepreneur and pilot. But for our listeners who don't know much about you, maybe it'd be great if you give us a bit of background on where you grew up, what your early childhood was like, and sort of your early career path.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a unique childhood. I was born in Cairo, and then 6 months old, my parents shipped me on a plane to West Africa, Nigeria, where basically my dad used to work. And he had been working there for over a decade at that point. It was an eye-opening experience because it was one of those things where you're working. So he's an agrologist by profession. So he used to work on sustainability projects for the World Bank. Yeah. So I landed in Nigeria 6 months old, and growing up there, I spent the first 10 years of my childhood in Nigeria and moved around quite a bit. My dad being an agrologist and all. So we moved from like southern Nigeria to north, which is completely different in terms of even cultures and like different tribes that run the country. But I quickly realized how blessed I was as a child, working, my dad being an expat. So I felt how blessed I was because, you drive around in a car and you'd see kids on the street with polio, hunger. You name it, it was there in a third world country. But we lived as expats, in these big houses, and we had servants and cars, and we were well looked after. So it started kind of clicking in as I got older, as that this is the life that we live was the minority of the minority, not actually the normal life. And it quickly opened my eyes to how blessed and grateful I should be as a kid, and to really go after what you really need and not necessarily what you want. And it's true, like the ancient Greek, when they say, give me a 7-year-old and I'll make a man out of him. It's truly the first 7 years, or I would say like the first 10 years of a childhood, really, in my opinion, dictates how you grow up and how you become at a later stage.
And was your parents instilling this in you at a young age, teaching you, hey, this is what the other side of the world looked like, stop, pause, think? Or was it something that you naturally just awoken to?
I don't think they needed to, because all it took is just to drive down to the local market or to go get groceries. I totally get how we need to instill that in our kids here in a Western culture because they're not exposed to it. But over there, they really didn't have to do much other than just drive around and show me the other side, and truly it was a compound where like all the expats worked for the World Bank. And the minute you left that compound, that was gated, if it was a gated community, basically, you would quickly realize the the fortune and the blessings that we had, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I remember my parents taking me to some pretty bad areas in the cities to show me that stuff. Obviously, not everyone's up for that. Or where my dad used to go to work at 4 in the morning at the food terminal. So I got a little bit of a taste of that, but I think Nigeria is a whole other level. Did you pick up any of the local languages there? And how did it inspire your, later focus on thinking about serving underserviced communities later in life?
Yeah, so over there, obviously, whether if you were a doctor or whatever, you'd actually normally drive. So they would have these doctors or remote hospitals that you'd have to drive an hour or two to get to, or a doctor would be scheduled to come and visit you, but it would all be done by car, right? Um, and this is kind of where the even though it was third world, but it was still connected on the grid somehow. The Nigeria being an ex-British empire, they did a really good job putting infrastructure, roads and things to be able to commute and to be able to even schools in small villages and stuff. But hospitals obviously were scarce. Disease is on the rise. Being a hot country, but the the inspiration growing up. So just to kind of give you a little bit back on like, so 10 years in Nigeria, I moved back to Egypt for 2 years. And then I came to Canada when I was 11 years old, almost 12. And growing up in Toronto, you quickly start counting your blessings again, because you're like, oh man, what if I had still been in Nigeria, where there's like civil war that broke out. Like, we left at a time where things were getting really dangerous in West Africa. So back around 1987 timeframe. But put it in perspective, fast forward a few years here, Telecom, we didn't have a phone, right? We barely had TV. So TV, we used to go rent VHS movies, right? And we would get it like once a week, because the nearest city that had that, we would have to go rent it from a club, drive back for 2.5 hours, and we would get the movies for like that, week. So it's like the Netflix that's not on demand, basically. And that's how we realized. And I'm not sure it actually asked me a question, but I kind of sidetracked a little bit here.
Well, I was wondering sort of how your understanding of like disconnected communities brought you to the point in which you moved to Canada at the age of 12 and you started getting interested in like space tech and communications and a passion for using technology to connect, underserved communities.
Absolutely. So actually, my passion for aviation and space came at a very early age. When I used to go with my dad to the fields and to kind of inspect and see how progress was being made, I used to see the crop dusters there. And I told my dad, oh, can I actually get in one of those planes? Because I'd always look up at the skies and realize, wow, this is really cool. As a kid, I was probably like 6 or 7 years old. I'm like, so I always envisioned myself being up there looking down, sort of thing, and just kind of seeing that big picture. And luckily enough, I was able to kind of get, on one of those planes. And actually, I caught the bug back then, probably at the age of 7, I would say. Fast forward, I'm in Canada. I finished my education from York University, which had a very unique program. It was only one of 4 universities at the time that had the space and communication science program, which is basically a double major between physics and computers and Earth and atmospheric science. So basically, it's a space engineering type degree. And my first intern job position for my co-op was at the Canadian Space Agency, which is located in Saint Hubert in Montreal. And I ended up moving there. Now, luckily, across the street from us at the Canadian Space Agency was Saint Hubert Airport, where it was a no-brainer for me to go and actually start realizing that dream that I had when I was 7 years old of becoming a pilot. And on top of that, being an employee of the space agency, they actually gave us some discounts that I couldn't basically say no to. And that's how I started flying. And it connected me to the ability to actually go to remote communities. I got offered a job at the agency in 1998. So after a first year of doing the co-op program, they liked what I did. They hired me back as soon as I graduated. and then stayed there for about 4 years. Now, one of my other dreams to be is to become an astronaut. That also kind of developed at the same time. Now, I did come close because I would shake hands with astronauts at the space agency. Mark Garneau, Chris Hadfield, Julie Payette. I would have lunch with them and enjoy a good time. But that's probably the closest thing I came to becoming an astronaut because my interest in telecom and by the way, at the space agency, we used to work on this really, really cool program called the RadarSat program. And the RadarSat program was way ahead of its time. It's basically this Canadian constellation. It was only one satellite at the time. It was RadarSat 1. But it was this Canadian satellite technology that would image the Earth using synthetic aperture radar. So it's not optical satellites where you would be blocked at night or if there was cloud. This would see right through, and it wouldn't matter day or shine. And you're able to penetrate through the clouds and see. And with the resolution back then was about a 5-meter resolution. Now, as the technology got better, you're able to get down to like less than a half meter, which is incredible from any like disasters or military reconnaissance type approach. So, having worked on that tech, the systems engineering group in charge of the RadarSat 1 mission, you get exposed to a lot of like this mission critical and next generation tech that would open up your mind to also another paradigm where now you're going extremes, right? Where you grew up in Africa where you had nothing, right? And now you can literally image the Earth instantly, right? Thousands of miles away by pushing a button, right? And that complete like 180 and contrast of, I guess, worlds that I lived, I think it helped bring about a lot of the ideas that that came about after and helped me kind of realize and help connect some of these underserved communities. And I'll tell you a little bit more after here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it sounds like it kept you grounded on one hand, but it also kept you super motivated and like inspired to see what was next around the corner. Because maybe you would have seen like something as a child, and you're like, okay, that's pretty cool, but I've already seen that before. And therefore you wouldn't look to see what was next around the corner. But because you were going from two different extremes in West Africa to the Canadian Space Agency and looking at and working on RadarSat, obviously, you saw some pretty amazing moments during your time working there. How did you think about kind of taking RadarSat and the experience of becoming a pilot and then the discovery of VoIP, voice over internet protocol, when you read that in the magazine in 1998, where did it take you from there? Because I feel like that was the biggest aha moment that started the next boom in your career.
Yeah, absolutely. So back then, I was introduced to the internet back in 1994 in a university lab, basically when we used to do internet exchange in the computer lab, and the AOL CDs. You're probably young to remember those days.
I remember them.
Yeah,
Yep.
so we used
I had
to get
older
those
brothers;
AOL.
they had them.
And so I was introduced to the internet back then in that realm. And when I first read this article in the magazine about how the internet's going to revolutionize the world, you couldn't really grasp the concept of what do you mean by real-time communications? What do you mean by, and mind you, we were working at a leading edge. I mean, the Canadian Space Agency, we had a direct link with NASA, so I was exposed to like the extreme end of it, but the concept of the internet being real time, video, audio, all that stuff was still incomprehensible for even a guy like myself, right? And so I started kind of dabbling with the tech, and luckily for me at the time, a friend of mine used to work at IBM. So back then, these servers, they were like little, I don't know what you call them. Like they're probably like this high. It was a big, like 40 kilogram device that you needed. And each server cost about $80,000. Now I couldn't afford that, being a freshman out of school, right? Basically on my first job to afford these two servers, because I needed two servers to dabble with the tech to say, hey, how do you get one computer to compress this audio, send it across some form of cable, which was the internet at the time, and which was slow speed and dial up in some cases, right, depending where you were, and then transmit it, decompress it on this other server, and then make it all work seamlessly, real time with audio only. There was no video capability at the time. So I was able to get my hand on some of these servers on a try before you buy program. So luckily, IBM had just launched that to kind of get companies interested, and got the approvals through my friend, that knew the guy at the right department to sign off on this. And basically, would try before you buy for 60 days, no commitment, no questions asked. I'm like, yep, sign me up. And I ended up getting these two big servers in my Montreal apartment. And my friends would come over and they see these cables running around from one room to the other. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, well, this is really cool tech. You can actually transmit a call from one server to the other, right? And they're like, yeah, so what's the big deal? I'm like, no. These servers could be like anywhere in the world, right? I was trying to explain it to them. So nobody really got it. The few that did, they ended up investing in the company. And it was just a part-time, after-hours kind of like hobby that ended up taking off real fast, to the point that even though it was my dream job working at the space agency with some of the world-renowned scientists and engineers, and we would go, like, some of the perks of the job, we would go see the NASA launches in Cape Canaveral, get like VIP seating, right? It was a dream job for a 23-year-old kid. I basically ended up submitting my resignation a few years back. My boss that I really liked at the time had left, and it was a much easier decision for me to make that happen. And I kind of embarked on the journey of voice over IP, or starting a telecom company as now a full-time position. Now, the sad part is, because I moved back to Toronto, where my parents were at the time, I didn't end up finishing my pilot's license, which plays a major role later on in the story, which I'll tell you, and kind of how we bridge the digital divide. But yeah, that's kind of like how that progressed. But one of the things that I quickly realized, flying out of St. Hubert and being in that small little plane, and I never really understood it as well, was this: the astronauts talk about the overview effect, right? Where you're above high and you see the world. We quickly realize how insignificant we are. Now, mind you, it's a much smaller scale being a pilot, because you're only flying at like 10,000 feet, or in a jet, maybe 40,000 feet. But the idea is, you still get to see that curvature of the earth, and you get to see really how insignificant we are. And all these, whether people are fighting or even having to go walk 2 kilometers to get like a bucket of water just for survival, right? Which I witnessed in Africa as a child, and it kind of quickly adds up together real fast.
Yeah, it definitely sheds a lot of perspective. I always wanted to think about like what it was like to be a pilot, spending half your life up in the air and half of it on the ground, and like almost living two different lives and perspectives on things. But I want to go back to this time and when you put these servers in your apartment, because like you don't just walk into, the business bureau and open up a telecommunications company, maybe in Africa, but not in Canada. So like, talk to me about those early days of Iristel. How did you think about setting up a telecommunications company in a very regulated industry? And what kind of lessons did you learn about sort of navigating a pretty bureaucratic and heavy red tape type of industry, especially like the Canadian telecom industry, when you launched?
Yeah, absolutely. So when these servers were put in production, so what ended up happening is, when the 60 days expired, I had a 60-day window to basically make this thing work. And not just that, make it work and land a contract of some sort, because the efficiencies here at the time, I don't know if you remember back in the day, like a long distance phone call from Toronto to Montreal was about $1 a minute, okay, which is insane. But that was the rate, okay. Let alone if you made a long distance phone call across the ocean to like France or UK or Egypt or any of these places, you're talking about $3 or $4 a minute. The beauty of this tech at the time, and why, real estate, they say location, 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 and technology, it's all about timing. It's the timing of when you introduce the tech. And at the time, this technology was able to compress anywhere between 4 to 8 the capacity of a single channel. So if you needed like 8 X of whatever to transmit a traditional call. You only needed one of that on a compressed call using voice over IP without losing any noticeable audio, right? Which is crazy, because now that same fiber line or same copper line can handle 8x as many phone calls, right? Without any noticeable compression loss to the human ear. And that's kind of how this whole voice over IP shaped the industry, because what I did in those 60 days, I tried to kind of look around and say, hey, who would be interested? Who's like one of the highest top 10 countries in the world that are paying for long distance or when you call? Ivory Coast was one of them at the time. And I just made cold calls to like the top 30, I would say, countries. Most of them were in Africa. And I ended up talking to a guy at the telco there and said, hey, I have this technology. Would you be interested in trying it out? And it would save you money, because I know a lot of the phone calls coming in, people are paying high money, and a lot of the phone calls going out, you're also paying quite a bit of money. So he basically said, well, if you make it work, we'll give it a shot, as long as it doesn't cost us anything. Now, at the time, I was taking the risk on my end, right, to install this equipment, and let alone in an African country where, there's a lot of civil unrest that happens, and any coup could take place, and I witnessed it, right? So, at this point in time, you're gambling with your whole livelihood, but I went all in, right? And luckily at the time, there was a spinoff from AT&T, a company called ITXC, that had left to embark on this technology as well to see how they can develop it. And it was all these like senior VPs from AT&T. So I ended up reaching out to them and I said, hey, I have this one client in Ivory Coast that I'm able to place these servers. Would you be interested? So basically they said, yeah, we'll give it a shot. So I basically had a buyer and a seller lined up. I flew to Ivory Coast, installed the equipment, and you're praying, you're counting. This is when like you don't want to be the cat with 9 lives because you only got one. and you're saying your prayers all the time, because if that thing doesn't work, I'm in the hole for basically $120,000 at that time.
Who'd you make the first test call to? Your parents?
No, it was from the first test call was between basically the same apartment, one room to another. That was the first test call. And I didn't have much because it was very hard and expensive to get a dedicated internet line at the time. Like there's no way you could have easily done it. So I was able to replicate and put all the parameters, latency and all that to be able to simulate what an Ivory Coast call would look like. And this is where my satellite experience kicked in, because in Ivory Coast, they didn't have even fiber or any undersea cables at the time. It was all using VSAT technology. So now you're adding a latency of about 650 milliseconds, which becomes noticeable to the human ear. So error correction issues. Long story short, the first successful test call happened between the US and Africa. And I didn't even bother trying Canada at the time for the first 2 years of this company, because I knew it was very hard. I needed to get momentum. I knocked on the door here and everybody told me, oh, lawyer fees is going to take you at least $150,000 to register. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go knock on another door, which happened to be across the other side of the ocean, basically. But if all doors are shut, it doesn't matter how far the next door is my point,
Isn't that amazing that the Ivory Coast moved faster in setting up a tech company like yours than Canada would have? Because everybody here sitting downtown says you got to get this feed done and this one done. It's like you probably had to call the Wildlife Federation, God's sake, to get it set up.
They basically, you know what it is? I always say the system is not broken in a Western country like Canada, in a first world country like Canada. It's not broken. It's just captured. Okay.
Right.
And regulatory capture is what kills innovation.
Bill Gurley says it perfectly. It's the way in which, why do you think Silicon Valley is so far away from DC?
Exactly. It's a perfect way. Exactly. And that makes a lot of sense, but you don't quickly realize that younger. It's like, why am I not able to do this? And you actually get frustrated, but you need to go through a process of frustration before you start understanding, okay, this is why it's like that. And as unfortunate as it is, it's actually sad in a way, because I'm a proud Canadian, and I know there's a lot of smart people that leave because of the stifling of an overregulation. Regulation is good, but overregulation, that's when things start breaking. But yeah, they moved because they needed something. And this is one of the other key things is when you have a product that somebody needs, you just need that one anchor tenant. Once you get your anchor tenant, then you scale.
So you founded Iristel in 99. It was a small startup focused on VoIP services, though, and you grew into one of Canada's largest independent telecommunications providers with an emphasis on IP-based wireless and wireline services. Obviously, going up against giants like Bell and Rogers and TELUS as a smaller player had some challenges and probably some big hurdles to overcome. But how did you navigate those early hurdles and those market dynamics dominated by some of these big telecom giants when you eventually launched in Canada? And how big did you end up getting?
So back to the, it's the whole anchor tenant model, right? You once you have an anchor tenant, it gives you the peace of mind to be able to innovate, right? Because the last thing you want to do is be able to live paycheck to paycheck, right? And if the company is struggling to a point where you're not able to innovate because you're worried about your finances, you're never going to be able to make that paradigm shift and fully. So, and that's why a lot of companies, by the way, like a lot of big companies are not able to innovate because what they don't realize is the minute you put it in that mold of the well lubricated engine they have is you're in a cast and you're not able to spin. You need to spin off. And a lot of companies create these like skunk works type projects or companies where it's running separate. It has its own budget, has its own everything, so it doesn't get stifled by big old monkey sort of thing. So going back to how I broke into that. So once I started building momentum as the kid on the block, because I would literally go to some of these meetings and these are like executives from AT&T, from, big companies, and they're looking at me as like, who's this kid that's going to get us, Cameroon, Angola? Like I went Cameroon, Angola, Egypt, Ivory Coast, Algeria. Like there was a lot of countries in Africa that I tackled, and it would be like a surgical strike. Say, hey, look, I could save you money. I can optimize your connection. So I built that portfolio where they would literally call me after and say, hey, Samer, can you get this going for us, right? And that's one thing about the Americans that I love, and I wish we had more of it in Canada here, is the ability to, they're more risk takers, right? Yes, I was a kid. I was Canadian, but they gave me a chance, right? Versus if I had come knocking on a Bell or any of the other companies here, the incumbents, they would have said, who's this kid? Go away, right? They won't even think about giving you a chance, right? And if they do, it's probably an order of magnitude lower percentage-wise probability in terms of making that happen. So I built my Rolodex of customers. I built a reputation, and then I started applying for licenses in Canada. So I took it full circle, went outside, brought the technology back, because we were ahead of the time. We were the first voice over IP class 5 switch where we were providing dial tone services in Canada at the time with servers in Canada, because a lot of them were still like, leasing stuff out of the US or like the Vonage, back in the day, the Vonage model. So all these companies actually came after, but they were also renting out servers to Canadians, but from the US. So we were actually a first Canadian deployment with licenses in Canada. And then shortly after, Bell introduced voice over IP and all that stuff happened. So time to market was, so I had that like first mover's advantage. Obviously, it came with a lot of pain because the technology wasn't fully vetted, and you would hope that like if somebody picked up a dial 911 that the call doesn't fail. There was like a lot of things that were still not perfected at the time, but it worked, and it satisfied the license requirements because I went through a different channel, which was over the top voice over IP versus going like the traditional Bell. Where it's a different type of license at the time, like as a reseller. And then I slowly went from a reseller model where I leased lines from a company called Group Telecom at the time, which Rogers ended up buying. And then I kind of went to build my own network. So it kind of went in phases, but my anchor tenants were my anchor tenants that kind of provided the funding to allow for me to make the jump and elevate.
And you launched, I believe, some subsidiaries as well underneath it, like Ice Wireless and Sugar Mobile, which I think, targeted the underserved markets, coming back to your original belief in terms of helping underserved communities. But you did face a little bit of regulatory sort of scrutiny, obviously, when you launched those brands. How did that sort of help you define your, obviously, mission more clearly? And what do you think founders should learn from your experience in facing these big roadblocks while being, the underdog fighting these incumbents in these heavily guarded and regulatory capture structured industries that they should think about when they're entering industries like healthcare, insurance, financial services, like more obviously regulatory heavy industries?
So one of the things that like how a lot of these companies, so there was Sugar Mobile, there's Ice Wireless. So that kind of I'm going to bring back the aviation side for a second because I had then completed. So I had some time, the company had taken off. This is around 2005 where I actually completed my pilot's license. I got a few ratings because when you first get a pilot's license, you can't, in Canada, the weather is very volatile, as we know. And, and you can't really like the initial license that you get, you can only fly during the day. So in wintertime, you only have like a couple hours to fly, right? And then you can't fly in cloud and you can't do. So I went through all the ratings and I actually ended up getting like my commercial and my full captain's license. I ended up one of the trips that kind of shaped the next phase of the company of being that from that startup that is only serving let's say the Torontos and the Montreals, like we call them the NFL cities or NHL cities, right? Uh, I embarked on this journey to kind of build my hours in my small little plane at the time. It was like a single prop, Cirrus aircraft. And I was part of the Buttonville Flying Club. And we ended up going to, on this mission to Alaska and back from Toronto. Okay. And part of the stops were a lot of these northern communities that were only flying communities, right? And you talk about like full circle back. Every time I stopped at one of these flying communities, we would go, these are all like indigenous, like rural, remote Arctic communities. And you'd see at the airport, you'd actually see a list of the timetable of when a dentist is going to fly in, when a doctor is going to fly in. And that brought me back because I'm like, wow, I was in third world Africa. They didn't even have that. They were actually more privileged than kids in our own backyard in the Arctic, right? This is Canada. And they don't have that luxury because they can't drive. It's a flying community, right? And then it started like the first stop, it didn't really click in. The second stop, third stop, it was in a place called Old Crow in Northwest Territories. And that's when it really kind of solidifies. This was like a multi-day trip all the way to Anchorage, Fairbanks, and back. And I'm like, okay, there's got to be a better way than this. They don't even have connectivity. So this was back in 2011. Okay, exactly. Actually, it was around the same week, August 2011, where we did that trip. And it just it started like getting to me to say, you know what, these kids are standing, sniffing hand sanitizers, sniffing gasoline because there's nothing else to do. Communities are completely isolated, right? And it's a whole generation lost, pretty much, if we continue down that journey. And I had the power because I knew how easy it was. I mean, I went to Africa to deploy these servers. I knew there's got to be a better way. So I started looking for options and ways to deploy in the Arctic. Now, at the time, believe it or not, Northwestel, which was a subsidiary of Bell Canada, was a monopoly. You could not deploy services in the Arctic unless you were Northwestel, which was the last standing monopoly by the CRTC, which is insane. I mean, you're talking about Canada, right? So I kept knocking on a few doors, and then I found out that they're actually going to open the competition, right? And we were the first. There was actually a Globe and Mail article about how Iristel was the first telco in Arctic Canada. What I mean Arctic is there are 3 territories, basically, right? And until today, Matt, believe it or not, we're the only independent telco that operates in all 3 territories. And how that happened, it actually started from that flying trip, because by the time I came back home, I was pissed. I'm like, it can't be Bella's making all the money. They're not even providing the service. They're getting the subsidy, right? And the African connection kind of clicked in all at once. I'm like, wait, there's got to be a better way. And we did deploy. So we were the first 3G deployment, okay, of smartphone services in a place like Iqaluit. So people would line up to get their first iPhone, for example, right? Because they all had like just the voice, like 2G, for example, right? And nobody would deploy a data network. This was no data, just voice and SMS. We're the first data network to deploy in the Arctic. And so many things happened after that. But the price I paid is I became under the spotlight of the incumbents, right? And the minute that happens, you're now fighting a different battle. It's not just the system that's captured. It's the incumbent themselves putting you under their target.
Well, I mean, this is a great lesson. One, kudos to you for seeing it with your own eyes and taking action on it. But it's also a good lesson on how subsidies in regulated industries like telecommunications basically inhibit innovation through so many different mechanisms, right? Distorted market signals, crowding out private investment, reducing risk taking because they're just comfortable in the way they are, right? They provide this financial safety net, which can lead to complacency among the subsidized, basically. Without the urgency really to innovate and survive, companies just stick with it. And also regulatory capture and stagnation, we already saw with that. And then the last thing is like just the dependency culture of how people are like, well, it's the only one there. We just should just rely on it. And I think that's a great lesson that we should learn, even though this happened almost 15 years ago, that we're still suffering from today. So kudos to you for doing that. I guess I want to understand though. So obviously, you made a pretty big mark in 2020. You were listed as one of Canada's top 25 immigrants for your contributions to bringing the digital divide to rural areas and remote areas. As an immigrant entrepreneur, you've been honored, in Canada for the work that you're doing and helping aspire newcomers to want to build businesses as well. How do you feel though about where we are now in terms of bringing more entrepreneurs to the front lines and trying to change the face of what we are doing here? And how are you thinking about where the gaps are still left to fill here in Canada?
So this is a concerted effort that needs to happen. So it has to be government and private sector that unite. And I'll give you an example. You mentioned subsidies, for example, right? Whenever we deployed out of our own, so we never got a penny to deploy in some of these rural remote areas, right? So we deploy out of our own dollar. And then guess what? The next day or the next month, Northwestel announced that they just got a $10 million subsidy from the Canadian government. Two problems with that. One is now it just devalues our dollar because if they get free 10 million, then our dollar it's not at par anymore, right? And on top of that, they already have a strong foothold that they don't need any more protection, right? And the problem with Canadian government that I noticed over and over and over again is you're never, as a bureaucrat, you're never going to get fired for going with what already works. Problem is, if what already works, sort of, with a few holes in the bucket, you're able to cover and camouflage these holes in the bucket. But to bring a whole new bucket with a different color, that's a problem because you will get fired for that if you take a chance on that, right? And that's a mindset that has to change. And I don't even know where to start other than at the educational level. The Americans seem to have done a much better job at taking risks. And I wish that translated somehow north of the border because there's so much potential and smart. Like I meet kids from universities I've mentored at different places, startups and incubator programs. And the talent that we have in Canada, that we should be not just number one, we should be like number one squared, like it's crazy. So it is sad to see that. So the lesson that, it's never going to be single-handed. And until it is single-handed, like if we think that an entrepreneur today with a great idea is going to be able to take on and flourish for Canada to shine, we're mistaken. And it's almost like one step forward, two steps back, right? Because the government will bring you that two steps back.
Right. I mean, you've obviously been a part of a couple of different companies as well. Besides being a licensed pilot, you obviously got into Carrier One. You're a partner and pilot at Fly GTA. How are you thinking about giving back now to the next generation of startups and founders? And how should people think about the ways in which you can bring value to their startup ideas and programs, given all the experience you've had as a successful founder?
Yeah, so it's all about connecting the dots, right? Like I can't say one experience has led me to, it's the exposure of multiple disciplines that allow you to kind of connect the dots differently than everyone else. And not to follow. And this is kind of like one thing from an immigrant. I think that being an immigrant gave me a huge advantage because I saw the world. And it doesn't have to be an immigrant. It's somebody that just well traveled at a very young age, right? you see the world from a different perspective. You're not growing up in Toronto or North York or Laval in Quebec, and you only see the world from that perspective, because you're never going to appreciate and take, even having an accent, you could, have it to your advantage, right? Like that, to that level. So a couple of things that you got to look at is stay off the beaten path. If it's already, if you're going to follow that path, you're probably not going to innovate, right? You got to solve the problem from a completely different angle. I created with the help of a few other people, a charity that is one of the pillars. It's called Healing Wings. So healingwings.org. One of the pillars is connecting the unconnected, bridging the digital divide, basically. And we've donated a lot of iPads and iPhones with SIM cards to orphans, to women's shelters, to basically help educate, because it all starts at a young age where you need to open their minds to what else is out there, right? And go off the beaten path. And guess what? If you knock on a door and that door is shut, don't give up. Even if you have to go halfway around the world to knock on the other door, just like in my case with Ivory Coast, right? Canadian government didn't give me a license from day one, right? So, and don't be discouraged by the political, let's say, lobbying that happens, because it's going to happen, especially in highly regulated industry. So I've tackled aviation. As a partner in a private jet charter company, aviation, we pay some of the highest rates in the world for airline, and the airlines don't survive here because there's a protectionist environment. Banks, so finance, open banking is going to help a little bit, which we're still late to the game. Like if you look at Europe, they're far ahead when it comes to open banking standards and all that, because here it's protected, right?
Even Nigeria is farther ahead than us. There's 78 countries that have open banking.
Even Nigeria, you're right. And the telecom, obviously. The other thing that the government has to embark on is they have to separate infrastructure so vertical separation. You cannot have an infrastructure company like Bell that owns the entire infrastructure across the country also compete. Spin it off, make it open access, spin off that infrastructure. That way any company can come and build a telco on their fiber. Till now we're fighting. Telus and Bell are fighting, which is so funny to see, because there are two incumbents. And because Telus has access to Bell's infrastructure, Bell is now, they're doing their crybaby.
They're feeling threatened. Yeah. So you obviously know this space well. You launched Carrier One. Tell our listeners what Carrier One is and how it's sort of breaking down the traditional telecom model with centralized power and profits, with your DPIN approach. And then I want to ask you about sort of like how you're thinking about other incumbents trying to come into the space and if they'll be more successful riding off of your coattails.
Yeah, so Carrier One, I'm super excited about that, Matt. I've, to your point, I founded a few successful companies, but Carrier One is kind of near and dear to me because it's, so you mentioned DPIN, and just for the listeners, DPIN stands for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. And if you think of like solar panels that you install on top of your roof and you sell electricity back to the grid, with Carrier One and DPIN, we're able to do the same thing in the telco space. So you can install a radio unit. This radio could be a Wi-Fi, could be a 3G, 4G, 5G. It's completely frequency agnostic. We don't care. But every time a smartphone or a device pings off your mini tower, and it could be a macro tower, by the way. We've installed in communities in the middle of nowhere on like 200-foot towers. But the beauty of this is the community owns the infrastructure, or the landlord owns the infrastructure. And every time there's a ping on that tower from a device, you monetize on every bit and byte that transmits off your device. And this is all possible. So back to the what I mentioned earlier about it's all about timing when it comes to tech. This couldn't have happened, let's say 5 years ago, because it's all running on blockchain technology in order to settle instantly and to incentivize the network to have that flywheel effect, right? And to have that shared and circular economy, you need a blockchain that can move at the speed of light, which is telecom, basically, right? And so if you think of like Bitcoin is kind of like a first generation blockchain. And then, Ethereum is like a second generation blockchain. You have Polygon, Solana, kind of like third generation. Then you have like newer ones like the SWI that we chose to build on, the SWI blockchain. And the reason is because of fourth generation, you have low latency, low gas fees, high uptime, because you can't afford to dial 911 and the call fails, right? So the timing couldn't be better because all this technology happened in the blockchain space to be able to settle and get the monetization going instantly with the low fees just in the last 2 to 3 years. Now, on the other side, on the telco side, because it's a marriage between Web3 tech and telco, right? And on the telco side, we started 3G where you have a macro network, where you can cover 40 kilometers, and then you moved on to 5G next G. 5G next G is all about densification. So you're going to need an antenna on every light pole. You're going to need an antenna on every building in order to bring, smart car like AI intelligence to the edge. And that's exactly the marriage of these two allows us to help we're an orchestration platform. We're not really a telco, but we dabble in the telco space because, you need to have the licenses, but we orchestrate to allow others to build the next generation network for their community, for their municipality, for an oil and gas mine, completely agnostic of any operator or frequency. And that's the power of that.
Right. And so you're kind of like, you've got these nodes basically that are sitting around on people's roofs and communities and stuff like that, acting as not just like a relay network, but really a decentralized model that obviously hopes to cover a broad range of use cases. But how does like a Starlink, for example, leverage something like this? Like, would there be other people leveraging the same sort of architecture that Carrier One is using?
Yeah. So a Starlink or a Bell or an AT&T, they're all centralized networks, right? The beauty of it is they're not typically last mile. Last mile, in order for it to build and to propagate properly, you need a decentralized model. And it's very obvious because even in the last, not a lot of people know this, but one third of the world's population today is not connected at all. They have no form of connectivity. And then 1/3 of that is also unbanked completely. So imagine now, like people that don't even have access to a bank account. So even from and the reason that is the telcos have not found the model that works for them to go and deploy in rural, remote areas and to be able to monetize on it effectively. So these come from the top and they deploy in Toronto in the metro areas because it makes sense. There's money there. But then you drive an hour north of Toronto and you lose access. And why is that? Is because there hasn't been a mechanism for them to be incentivized enough. And the only way to make it happen is to allow these communities to build the networks in harmony with the operator, because sometimes you need the spectrum. Like these operators spent billions of dollars. So we're not trying to displace the operators that own the spectrum. We're trying to augment and help them spread even faster. And the only way to do that is through decentralization.
Okay. So we talked about obviously Carrier One. I want to talk about lastly about your experience as a pilot and also using technologies like Starlink while also being a co-founder of Kepler Communications. Talk to us about where you think the need to be owning your own infrastructure as a country in this geopolitical world that we're in now takes precedent over the best access to the best technologies. Like, where do we want to play in Canada when there are obviously better, more advanced technologies available out there from third parties versus trying to buy local and stay, kind of true to staying supportive of our own local economy? How do you think about that when you've tested, I'm sure, a bunch, while also being a founder of, co-founder of one of the most successful Canadian satellite companies?
Yeah. It's definitely a fine line there because I love the Starlink, especially the Starlink Mini. I mean, the Starlink is one thing, but when the Mini came about, I literally just popped it in my plane, and now I fly with it everywhere to get me access, because to go through a certification process on technology that's been around for a while, it would take too long, and the speeds are not even as close as to what the Starlink Mini can do, right? So there was definitely a disruption model here that happened, and it's unfortunate that we as Canadians are a little bit behind on that front, because once again, it's back to the government creating the problem. Okay, and this happens by giving subsidies to incumbent operators instead of going to an incubator program at, let's say U of T or York, where they're probably a group of students could design a LEO constellation, but they need money, right? It's not a lack of brains, it's lack of money and the environment to make it happen. Now, it upsets me that we spent like $1 billion on Telesat. Telesat has had a chance for the last 30 years to make something, and they did it. And Starlink came and just ate their lunch, right? So I think the sovereignty piece I think is going to have to take a sidestep for now until we get our act together, because sovereignty is going to be a critical component for any nation to strive. Self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency starts by being sovereign in every aspect, even in your crop produce, right? If you cannot self-sustain and you have to depend on another country to survive, you're not even going to have the people to build the tech for you, right? And this is a big problem that I think we're starting to realize now with, even like our closest allies, the US. Look, it took an American to get us to wake up and realize our shortfalls here in Canada. Like, why don't we have interprovincial trade? Why did it take an American president for us to figure that out, right?
100% agree.
So that's kind of like the issue there. And so I think there's still hope. I think we could do something. But until then, we just have to secure ourselves by figuring out investing, not putting all our eggs in one basket. And giving some of that funding. If it's $1 billion, give it to 3 or 4 companies. One is going to be a unicorn. Investors have done that. VCs do that all the time. They invest in 20 companies with the hope that one will be the unicorn. The other 19 are going to fail, and they're fine with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm glad you said it, because someone who's worked in many different industries and countries, seeing how there is an opportunity still here to do something, but we need people from the outside maybe to point us in the right direction. Is something I've said a lot here on the podcast. I could talk to you forever, Samer, but I would love to just wrap things up here with our fast favorites. So first thing, your favorite podcast.
I got 2. One is Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan. Those are my 2 favorite. Yeah.
Okay, nice.
I love the extremes.
Yeah, those are 2 extreme ones. I love it. 2 on both opposite sides of each other, but definitely extremes. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog.
I don't know if you've ever seen Shelley Palmer's stuff. But he's a professor with like AI intelligence and insight and stuff. So I like to get his tech newsletters about what's latest and greatest out there. But yeah.
Nice. Next is your favorite tech gadget.
Oh man, Starlink Mini by far. If you had asked me that question before, maybe it wouldn't have been, but I definitely love that thing.
And what about your plane? What kind of plane?
It's an Eclipse jet. It's the smallest twin engine jet, but it goes up to 41,000 feet. So you got the mileage.
So you go 41,000 feet and you can go all 24/7. No restrictions on you, I guess, as a commercial pilot.
Yeah. No restrictions.
That's amazing. Okay. Next is your favorite new trend.
New trend, I would say, deepen, this whole movement of deepen and how, communities can kind of take control of their own destiny. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
No, it's a fantastic. Next is your favorite book.
Favorite book. There's one that it's called Innovator's Dilemma. I forget the name of the author now, but it'll come to me. But Innovator's Dilemma is the name of the book.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a very famous book, obviously. That one that we feel like we're going through right now. It was written by Clayton Christensen in 1997.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
it's
absolutely.
Definitely one for the ages. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson.
One thing is, even though I'm not a big believer of luck, but I'll say luck favors the brave, and whatever that luck is, whether it's God guiding you or whatever it might be, God has played a major role in my life, but he favors the brave, and I can attest to that. And I've been brave to make some bold moves, and it's worked out. So luck favors the brave.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with Samer Bishay from Iristel.
Thanks, Matt.